Hello and welcome back to This Spectred Isle, telling maritime ghost stories from around the islands of the North Atlantic. It's a very grey, damp, foggy Halloween here in Newfoundland, the sort of day when you could hardly tell sea from shore, so I thought it was very apt today to tell a story about a wrecker. Wreckers were supposed to be people who would put out false lights and lure ships to their doom on the rocks, then plunder all their goods. They're particularly feared and particularly spoken of in legends and beliefs around coastal areas, of course. And today's story comes from one area that's very rife with wrecker stories, the southwestern corner of England, Cornwall. This story comes from the town of St. Just and begins with the arrival of a stranger, a man who decided to rent a cottage in the village right along the coast. And rumours began to circulate about who he had been before he arrived, why he'd come there, and what he might be doing now. People thought that perhaps he'd been a pirate, and after quarrelling with his shipmates, they'd put him ashore. They also noticed that an unusual number of shipwrecks would take place around his house. It wasn't long before they realised what he was doing. He would take a horse, and he would tie a rope around its neck, and around one of its legs, and put a lantern around its neck, and then send it out along the coast in the darkness. As the horse walked along with a sort of jerking motion, the lantern would sway, imitating the motion of a ship's lantern at sea. Ships passing by would see this and wrongly assume that they were looking at a patch of open sea. They'd sail closer, and soon enough they wouldn't be able to escape the rocks. The wrecker would go out, of course, and murder any survivors, and then plunder everything that was on board. He was not a young man, however, even when he arrived, and it wasn't long before the years began to catch up with him. Although he'd shown no fear or trepidation or remorse in life over his deeds, on his deathbed this began to change. Clergymen who attended him in his final days said that he would cry out things like, "Do save me from the devil and from those sailors there waiting to tear me to pieces." They assumed that he was seeing visions of his former shipmates, the very pirates who'd set him ashore in the first place. That whatever argument they'd had in life, it still wasn't over in death. They also saw the devil appear and hover about the room in various guises. They'd tried to get rid of him, and he would simply change shape yet again, finally assuming the form of a small buzzing fly. It was then that they realised there was no way they were going to get rid of him, probably because they didn't have a fly swatter. Meanwhile, a pair of harvesters working in a nearby field heard a voice crying out, "The hour has come, but the man has not come." They looked out towards what seemed to be the source of the sound, out by the coast, and they saw a ship sailing in towards the cliffs, a great black square-rigged vessel. It was sailing against the wind and the tide. As it drew closer, they saw that there was not a soul on deck, and that great black storm clouds were gathering about the masthead, and rolling out towards the house of the wrecker. Just as suddenly, the clouds drew back, and the ship vanished. The people of the village thought the best thing to do was to get this man buried properly as quickly as possible. Things had gotten strange enough for their tastes, and whatever the man had done in life, and whatever was happening to him after death, that was really none of their affair. But it seems that the people in charge of preparing his body for burial were not the ones to carry his coffin to the churchyard, because those who did said that it was far too light to contain a body. Also, a strange note was that a great black pig appeared out of nowhere and followed the coffin bearers to the churchyard. Once they arrived, the weather once again turned, and this is not entirely unheard of. In coastal areas, the weather can change very quickly, but this was twice now in connection with the same man, and so it was beginning to look a little bit odd. The coffin bearers set down the coffin and ran inside the church for shelter, thinking they'd wait for the storm to pass, and then they would get this man buried, and then they wouldn't have any more strange weather to worry about, other than the strange weather that was already fairly normal for their part of the world. But when they came back out again, they found that the coffin, apart from the handles and the nails, had been completely consumed by lightning. This is the version of the story recounted in Westwood and Kingshill's The Fabled Coast, a book that I recommend for anyone who's interested in learning more about the maritime folklore of the British Isles. Their version is retold from an 1870 telling by William Bottrell in his book Traditions and Hearthside Stories of West Cornwall. So if you're interested in checking those out, I will put the information about both of those books in the notes below. I'll also include the link to the Ko-fi page for this project, as well as the map showing where all these stories have taken place. And I'll include the links to my creative partners in my website and to our Patreon page, which we've just launched and which we're very excited to share because we have some projects that we're really looking forward to putting out into the world fairly soon. Thank you so much for joining me today. Happy Halloween, and please do come back for the next one.